Did the Fed save the stock market? Is this a bear market bounce? And why is Bitcoin the least volatile it's been since early in the year? Yes, crypto is asleep. And is that because the bond market put it to sleep? And how about these AI equities moving 25% in one day with a record rip in KOSPI? Is that a bear market rally or is it over? Is the whole AI hysterics over? We'll go through that in the PowerPoint and discuss what's next for Bitcoin and these AI stocks. This is the market update. I am your host, Bill Noble. If you need a roadmap in crypto, subscribe to this channel. Turn on alerts so you know when we're going live. And if the content works for you, don't forget to hit the like button. Last night, we started out with what they call a hawkish hold by the Bank of Japan. That was followed by the Fed's hawkish hold, whatever that means. And there's something very interesting going on, I think, with the Fed. In other words, you have a situation where everybody is saying something except the guy in charge. So all of a sudden, Bitcoin is left wondering, are they going to put liquidity into markets to save us? Are they going to pass the Clarity Act? And why did they come in to save Nasdaq? Don't worry, we'll go over the TA. And if you're out there, please feel free to put a 1 in the chat. All right. Now let's start with some good news. Some genuinely good news for crypto, right? It's an absolutely savage post from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He says, more than a year ago, the House passed the Clarity Act. There's been progress since, thousands of negotiations, and Senate Republicans produced a floor-ready product that's ready for a vote. It's disappointing, but not surprising that the left is choosing politics over making America a big leader in crypto. American exceptionalism was once a bipartisan goal, and here's the key. If clarity fails, I have serious doubt. Okay? Nothing could be further from the truth than Clarity Act, doesn't have the safeguards that everybody needs. If anything, Clarity Act puts like a regulatory framework around crypto so that, they can keep track of bad guys. Police associations have endorsed the bill. America will lead or America won't. It's not more complicated than that. And here's the kicker. I believe Satoshi once said it best. If you don't believe me or don't get it, I don't have time to convince you. Sorry. This is from the Secretary of the Treasury, who thought the Secretary of the Treasury would ever be quoting Satoshi. But that's exactly what happened yesterday, even though Bitcoin really hasn't moved while this violent Nasdaq convulsion has unfolded. I still think a Clarity Act passage at this point becomes a positive catalyst for Bitcoin. The good news for Bitcoin is that yesterday's MicroStrategy earnings call was not a negative for Bitcoin. Although I do think it's interesting that when they advertised this strategy earnings call, there's 3 other people on the thumbnail other than Michael Saylor. So Saylor embarrassment is still there in Bitcoin, and I don't know why. Because the real embarrassment is this like massive leveraged casino that I thought was going to tear the whole system apart in equities. And frankly, it's still not clear whether this was a bear market rally, which it could be, right? In other words, when you have stuff up 25% in one day, you have to sort of ask yourself, what's going on. Is this a bear market rally and our bag holders going to use this to sell, or was it just a completely grotesque month for momentum stocks? And I think the real sign of a bottom, which of course showed up after the stream, was a hedge fund got liquidated. And I always say, when somebody gets liquidated, when somebody is just, when it hits the tape that someone's out of business, it's over. Which is exactly what happened when all these hyperscalers and all these related stocks went down so much that it actually resulted in a liquidation of a hedge fund. I was like, oh my God. And, when you look at CoreWeave on a daily basis, right? This is just like one hyperscaler example among many. So CoreWeave, one of the more leveraged players out there, went from 130 to 60 in like a month. Now, when you have that and you have this like climactic Armageddon style puke, you can have these like gigantic bounces, particularly since KOSPI, which is the Korean stock index driving the entire world, bounced 18% and filled a huge gap, which is here, right? So we're going to go over to TA, the bond market, Bitcoin. This is an absolute monster rally after two failed buy signals. Basically what happened here, right, is that, the buy signal was actually here, but the selling climax that washed out the leverage, it's just what it said. It just completely blew out any leverage that was left. And then what happens when you have forced selling, as I always say, it's kind of like a basketball underwater. So the leverage unwind, the forced selling, you push the bonds. You push the basketball deep underwater, deeper, deeper, deeper. And then once you let go, it pops all the way to the surface and pops all the way out. Unbelievable. And that's what happened in all AI stocks yesterday, where you would have KOSPI up 18%. You had semiconductors up 8%. And the wild volatility in these markets continues. Now, one thing that I would like to just simply note, like particularly for semiconductor stocks, is that this is SOXX. You're going to start running into like some kind of volume resistance as they fill this gap. So, is it like, and if you look at the hyperscalers just on the chart over here, we'll talk about it in the PowerPoint, CoreWeave, NBIS, APLD, and IREN especially because that's like a crypto connected stock in a way, right? We're up 25% yesterday. And of course, as you see, right, this massive puke into the discount zone by IREN turns around and results in this violent snapback. And you have to ask yourself, in the AI trade, was all that irrational? And it's pretty ironic that the TA report that we put together for our Patreon group was actually wildly accurate in the sense that it wanted to buy Nasdaq at around 27,200, which was pretty much close to the low before it ripped up. And the question remains, did one day or 1 week or 1 month change the narrative? Or is this a golden BTFD opportunity because the Fed, the Treasury, or whoever simply and plainly cannot let NASDAQ fail? In other words, the president of the United States frequently talks about, the amazing action in the stock market and how that validates policies. And the question is, Can they let it go down? And the answer so far this morning is no. No. And of course, back to Bitcoin. Bitcoin will run on liquidity. So what is the Bitcoin chart that matters the most? And it's the chart of the bond market. Yes, I know. Sounds crazy, but we talked about this yesterday. And let me recap. So Uncle Sugar needs $2 trillion a year. The hyperscalers have borrowed $200 billion so far, and they need another $800 billion. So the bond market is just like, you know what? We're going to charge you guys a lot more for money. And then there's this narrative where everybody and their brother, particularly Fed governors, like I'm going to share this, is on the tape literally saying, hey, I think we should be taking action against inflation. Wow, guys, on it after 6 years. Inflation created by oil and Nasdaq. Crazy, right? I mean, what is the Fed going to do? Bring down Nasdaq? Nasdaq brought itself down. Okay. So you have all these guys doing anti-liquidity talk or talk against any type of liquidity. Meanwhile, I think what they really did was they're going to have to save the bond market. So this is the long bond contract, and these are two alpha intelligence buy signals at the discount zone in long bonds. So ZB is the symbol. And I think Bitcoin rises and falls with what happens here. It's not just Nasdaq, because Nasdaq was like all over the place with these stocks up 25% or down 100%. I'm sorry, down 50% for the month. And then they turn around and rip 25% in one day off the lows, including the financing companies that, finance the sludge, or some of them. Bitcoin will rise and fall whether or not central banks decide to save the bond market, whether or not they hike rates or not. Bitcoin needs liquidity. Bitcoin needs some kind of push from the Fed. And of course, they're all talking in the opposite direction, which is why Bitcoin just sits still. Now, the good news for Bitcoin, along with the fact that, they had to save Nasdaq, or they're going to have to save Nasdaq or KOSPI, one way or the other, right? It's like two angles. Either everybody is out in KOSPI who was going to get out, or the margin babies have all been liquidated, or there was some sort of central bank push to put high-powered money in the system to arrest the decline, hence the huge nature of the rally. Meanwhile, Bitcoin is so, quote, depressed that the Bollinger Bands are at like post-Christmas levels, meaning Bitcoin is so not volatile, not quiet, right? My guy Omar is reporting that Bollinger Band width in Bitcoin is now at the lowest level since 2026. Or the start of 2026, excuse me. Are we due for a major move in Bitcoin? Does this volatility leak from, say, Nasdaq to the bond market over the Bitcoin? Because normally that's how it works. That's how it works. Volatility leaks from market to market. All right. So for one of our friends, we're going to take a look at ZBCN. I also looked at Hyperliquid this morning. Not much of a change from where we were yesterday. So let's take a look at ZBEC for some live TA, which there'll be a lot of today for sure. Okay, let's get ZBCN up for one of our loyal Okay, so this is unfortunately all of crypto where everything is like down only, which is the reverse of KOSPI, which was in an up only phase. The good news is it looks like all the major puking is done. Lux Algo buy signals pending. So that's where you would put a large part of crypto, particularly in the altcoin space. And I think you also have to ask yourself, this is important about Nvidia. We'll share this. Bitcoin may also be rising and falling with this. So Nvidia and Bitcoin don't have the same problems. There's nothing wrong with Nvidia in terms of the amount of money that it makes. However, as we discussed yesterday, there may be some problems with its accounting. And one bounce and one day doesn't really solve that problem. But if you want to know, where we are in AI or where we are in this trade where you connect, Bitcoin and the AI hyperscalers, we can look at this PowerPoint just to get a flavor for what exactly happened yesterday. So the domino effect is not here yet, right? So Iron, CoreWeave, they're up 20%. KOSPI was up 18%. Both Goldman and a private equity fund bounced hard. Blue Owl up 6.4%. And Bitcoin declined to participate, period. Long Bitcoin, short the banks did not work yesterday. Say it before the chat says it. Okay. It did not work yesterday. That does not mean the market is going to want to take any more hyperscaler debt or any more government debt. That remains to be the key. So spare capacity was disclosed. No one stated a use for it, and this was all set on an earnings call, absent any real statement from the Fed, except for these pinheads that are trying to make themselves famous by going, yeah, I wanted to hike rates. So Meta was the worst on the screen. Microsoft was up 15%. CapEx confidence split in two. In other words, some people believe the CapEx is good. Some people believe the amount of money that they're spending is bad. And then all you got was a giant liquidation trade. They just literally liquidated absolutely everybody. So which channel reversed? So nothing was resolved on the financial end, really. The debt, the collateral, the refinancing, and the forced sales hasn't changed the picture so far, and it was only 1 day or 2 days, right? Contracts have not repriced. Customers, contracts, suppliers, utilization. I saw a Meta got 35,000 applications for trade skill workers to help build their data centers. 35,000. And the Fed wants to hike rates into that as an aside. So investors bought the labels straight back. AI baskets, etc. They just took everything that there was. So the bond market is deep in the discount zone, right? Relief, not debasement. A yield drop may not do anything for Bitcoin. So it does depend on the bond market, but you've got to get a really chunky rally in the bond market to get something going. So market didn't break down. No real upside for Bitcoin. It's still different than AI. It doesn't have any leverage, but it's in a range. All right. And the real test is Contagion may arrive later. Like Contagion takes quarters if there is a problem with hyperscaler debt. And obviously that's not there now. And I don't think the Fed is ever going to let it get there. That's the real lesson from yesterday. In other words, this thing can get to a point where they liquidate margins, they liquidate the hedge funds. And again, that was the real big, oh my God, trade where it's like, this is, obviously the market bounced. And obviously there's still a problem with this debt, and Bitcoin does not have that problem. which is why, Bitcoin being down 1% is not the end of the world. Bitcoin bears, just to be fair, Bitcoin bears will say, quiet, silent periods in Bitcoin are preludes to a much larger down move, right? That's what happened earlier in the year. If you go back to this chart, Bitcoin got very quiet, sat there, tried to rally, and then the big disappointment trade followed. All right. So is Bitcoin going to break out to the upside? That largely depends on whether or not they come in to save bond market, hyperscaler debt, and hyperscaler stocks. Because as we noted yesterday, there was absolutely no doubt about it. What was going on in Korea and what was going on with the tech stocks was a risk to the financial system. You had the big banks react. And you know what? The Fed let the crisis part of that go on for like a week or whatever central banks, right? The Bank of Japan came in and backed off any rate hike talk. They successfully defended the yen. And again, Bitcoin just kind of sits here and you wonder, honestly, is it ever going to move again? Now, of course, when you start asking yourself that, that's exactly when it does. Like the Bank of Japan came in and crushed the dollar. There were a lot of reasons for Bitcoin to move. It just didn't. It just didn't. So let's take a moment to welcome who's here before we dive face first into all the TA that's out there, all the brave souls joining us this morning. Maiku, best regards from Poland. Stay safe out there. John 316, Wing Raven, Art from the Amsterdam airport. Boom, we collect cards. A Spartan Colonel, I made the stream. Welcome. Odd Dark, a member. Yav is here. Welcome. Ryan. Wing Raven said, can you imagine the carnage if they let it crash 75%? Yeah, I mean, I just don't think after the way this thing treated and this one hedge fund went out of business that they can afford to have more than one hedge fund go out of business. And a lot of times when that happens, it's over. It's over. Daniel's here. Get him, baby. Shelly Farmer, the one-woman hedge fund, is here. Does Polkadot have a chance to come back? Dude, I think if anything comes back, it's going to be Chainlink. Right? Chainlink's got to connect all these different banks to the blockchain. Loco for Crypto is here. Let's go to TA. All right. Long bonds. Very important. Very important. So crypto thrives on liquidity. Is crypto going to get liquidity? It looks like right now, today, no. Because as, Nasdaq kind of fades, nobody's really in the mood to buy long bonds. You've got some pretty good signals here from Alpha Intelligence, but one thing we've seen is you get these buy signals, and then they try to sweep it or take it out. So can Bitcoin get the liquidity that it needs? Because the Fed needs to come in and really stop this. Or is the Fed just going to let it go? So if you're wondering why Bitcoin is down, it's because, the liquidity that got pumped into the system basically went to the stock market. Now, Nasdaq, let's look at this. So this is the Nasdaq futures contract on a 1-hour chart. And what you can see is Nasdaq did a wonderful job of trapping everybody who shorted this thing since July 26th. So 4 days of puking unwound in a matter of hours, right to both a Lux Algo and Alpha Intelligence resistance area, and then Nasdaq starts coming off. You have to assume that bag holders are going to use a huge rally to get out. And as they always say, retail sells the first uptick. And one way that I think hedge funds are headed for the beach is Apple went down. In other words, part of the malaise in Bitcoin is that we just can't get institutional interest. That's because everybody is hiding in things like Apple. Now, I also think there may be some hiding going on in Bitcoin because Bitcoin does not have the hyperscaler problem. But, Apple came off 1% yesterday during the Nasdaq rebound, and maybe everybody's saying, I'm just going to square up my books and leave. I'm going to cover the shorts. I'm going to sell out the longs. We'll see you in September. And you know what? With this level of volatility, can you actually blame them? Okay, like I was saying earlier, if you look at the CoreWeave chart, it's unbelievable. From 130 to 60, and now CoreWeave, as of yesterday, was pressing into this major Lux Algo resistance zone. Is it going to be able to break out? KOSPI is really funny because KOSPI, the rally was big enough to fill a gap and take out a Lux Algo trend line. Now, just one word about the way these bear markets kind of trade, right? In other words, actually, let's pull the KOSPI chart back up again. Okay. So in a bull market, you take the stairs up. Like this is classic bull market up only price action. One blip and the gamblers are back in on any dip. Okay. And then when it goes down, it takes the elevator down. Stairs up, elevator down. Now, when you have these bounces like this that fill a gap, get to resistance, the key always is, okay, it gets to resistance, but can any of these things break out? In other words, if people who buy the dip, can they actually make money, or are you going to start running into bag holders who need to get out? I think, when you see 25% in one day, even though, the stocks have been totally destroyed, and Kramer is undoubtedly going to be act today going BTFD, 20% in one day does not inspire confidence. You want to see it go down and then maybe base, and then it rips back up. But 25% in one day is a little bit cringe, a little bit. And I continue to believe that Bitcoin does not have the same problem that these other these other products do. They don't have the accounting risk. That's why this stuff went down. Yes, they got over levered in KOSPI, but that story was over-reported until it actually had systemic risk, where you could have Korean brokerage firms or banks blowing up, and you're probably going to have some kind of recession over there with the amount of young people that got liquidated. In fact, one of the biggest cases for Bitcoin or crypto that doesn't show up on the tape is how sad it is that all these people under the age of 35 were wildly participating in this casino just in an attempt to make enough money to get involved in things like housing, because housing is high because of currency debasement. It's like buy a real asset, sit on it long term. That's exactly what's going on everywhere. But it's a shame that young people are caught in this. And there was a guy, I'm not going to name names, but there was a guy, and I empathize with this, who was like, Bill, I'd love to support the channel, but I don't have enough money to buy food. I'm borrowing money to buy food. Now, obviously, there's a lot of NASDAQ people who are borrowing against their stock who don't care, and they'll spend money on anything. And then there's this whole section of the economy that's getting wiped out. And they were the ones gambling in KOSPI. Like this is the real thing, the real lesson that I don't think is being kind of, discussed. Why was there all this gambling in KOSPI? Well, I don't know, because people at a certain level of the economy need to pay their bills. There was a program from the US government where they were offering cybersecurity education with a path to a government job, 15,000 applications. They had to shut it down. Meta offering like what you would call trade school, carpenters, plumbers, electricians for their data center. Right, like come in, get training for 4 weeks, come work for the lizards or take your certification and go somewhere else. 35,000 applications. Like all these Fed governors that want to hike rates are not looking at what I would call labor market growth. So, they can't stop selling bonds. I don't think that has anything to do with inflation. I have to think that that's got something to do with what I would call crowding out. In other words, you have two big giant players trying to get money. And I think the only way out of that is debasement. Now, is the market trading that this morning? No. So let's go to some crypto TA. Even though all the excitement is over there in stonks. So Zcash on a 1-hour chart headed for its discount zone. The real juicy level, I think, is 400. That feels very far away. But Bitcoin on a 1-hour chart is same old, with a possible breakdown out of a bear flag. Traditionally, these things had been bullish in crypto where you have these upward sloping ranges. And we kind of hope that it is. But unfortunately, we may have to accept the fact that this may be either crypto's turn out to the woodshed or maybe this Nasdaq rally fails. I mean, I hate to say this, but we rise and fall now with Nasdaq. We are entering a period, just to talk about a little bit of market history. We are in a period where stocks can get epically volatile. There's a solar eclipse coming up. You could argue that this solar eclipse is kind of connected to this bizarre invasion in Spain, right? Where, I don't know, 50,000 guys, 50,000 men only just decided to swim across the ocean and land in Spain. 50,000 guys hit a beach town with 85,000 citizens. The job of governments is to protect the people. Where's the protection there? And again, this all goes back to an argument for crypto that crypto people are probably exhausted with. That said, things like 1929 and 1987, big, scary down moves in equities, all had one thing in common in that they topped out in late August, or the major rollover started in late August. So can you have corrective bounces in Nasdaq? Well, you just had one. You have corrective bounces in KOSPI? You just had one. But where is this stuff going a month from now? A lot of that's going to be bond market dependent. Like crypto needs liquidity help. So to the extent Nasdaq scares everybody into them pushing money into the market, because don't tell me these AI stocks went up 25% on their own. Don't tell me that. They saw this thing. They're like, this is going to get out of control. A hedge fund just failed. We cannot have a series of hedge funds fail. Keeping in mind where there's one roach, there's a million. So they jacked up the market at the end of the quarter to try to save people. Period. Because we cannot have this accelerate, particularly in Korea. Because if you look back at KOSPI, and I'm trying to paint a picture where saving KOSPI benefits Bitcoin, even if Bitcoin is down today. So if you look at this big picture, KOSPI, after a buy signal or multiple buy signals where, it just didn't work, has retraced 50% of its big 5-wave trend up. You see, this is the high up here. KOSPI retraced 50% of that move in a month. So it took from April of 2025 to July of 2026 to do the move. And then it took a month for a 50% retracement. And that's staggering if you think about it, right? You have effectively washed out all of the gamblers. I mean, is there anyone left? I mean, we'll find out if the rally fails, because, that is another bear market tenet, transitioning, right? Beware. There's a couple of axioms for bear markets, right? Beware the failed rally. So yeah, that rally yesterday was friggin' spectacular. It looks like they're trying to do it again today. Great. Terrific. You don't want to see this rally like rush up today and then fail badly. That's switching from correction to like real bear for like a couple months. So beware the failed rally, and don't feed the bear by jumping in to say KOSPI or semis up 8%. Let it trade for a couple of days, because if it just keeps rushing up and rushing up, bag holders will eventually be getting out, because our call from the YouTube member area, which was frankly spot on, was that semis were done. That's it. She said it flat out on the stream. Semis were done, and they were, and they probably still are. Because, if you look at, if we go back to Nvidia, and I still think this makes the case for Bitcoin. Bitcoin does not have the problems that Nvidia does. There is no accounting problem in Bitcoin. There's, a liquidity problem, meaning we're not getting the real pump we need from the Fed. The Fed is out there sitting on it. The Fed peanut gallery is out there telling everybody, oh, we should have hiked rates. What a joke. What a joke, right? Basically, what does Nvidia do now? Is Nvidia going to find support and go up and blow through this triangle? Because that would be super constructive, right? That would be end of correction and higher if Nvidia was able to get back inside that triangle. A lot of support down here. I think our technical models actually wanted to buy it. I think our technical model, I don't think it ever got to where our model wanted to buy it. I think it was like 180 something, right? But Nasdaq did. And, Bitcoin is not doing anything exciting. We're hoping that there's no waterfall lower like 2018. We did address that in Patreon. But it's important. It's important to know what to look at, because I think on a macro level, this is very confusing. Very confusing. And I think one of the key things to watch, believe it or not, is my old employer, Goldman Sachs. So you did attack the 4-wave, the final wave before the top. And you did come back. So this doesn't look terrible. But if you look at, Blue Owl, which is a private equity company, it remains to be seen whether or not this is a full-on breakout from this Lux Algo formation. In other words, all the damage that's been done has been done. And this type of stuff and this type of sludge is going to rally. Morgan Stanley is kind of the same thing. Now, I think when you have Morgan Stanley, you may have this head and shoulders top. Is it valid or isn't it? You're going to find out today. Like, I think these financial stocks are going to be the key. If these financial stocks come back and there's no need to save them, that's Bitcoin negative. If these financial stocks continue to roll over, or if everybody fed the bear by trying to buy the dip and buy all this stuff when it was up and the rally fails, that's when you get the liquidity that you need for Bitcoin. The alternative Bitcoin argument, just to frame it all, and I'll tell you what I think, can Bitcoin get the liquidity it needs to prevent what the 4-year cycle guys are claiming can happen in August and September, where it just gets completely wasted? Because no one's interested. That's the key, right? I mean, it's mind-boggling to see crypto equities moving in 25% increments and Bitcoin sitting and doing nothing. Okay. Eric Deck Builder says, if you don't own Bitcoin, you're a moron. Okay. Which is very interesting. What's next for Zcash? Okay. Well, let's go over Zcash in depth. Definitely don't have any problems doing live TA today, especially in crypto when, all the wild action appears to be in equities, which is, nauseating unto itself. Okay. So Zcash big picture is at its equilibrium. So Zcash is probably neither bullish nor bearish. You do have this big kind of triangle forming, or that formed in Zcash. You could argue if 463 held, something good might happen. I think bigger picture, it feels like Zcash wants to fall to equilibrium, at 400. Let's look at the 1 hour chart. One hour chart, it's headed for its discount zone. I have so much trouble, even though, today is crypto's day to get taken out to the woodshed. I mean, everybody got taken out to the woodshed this week. And if hedge funds are being liquidated, that means their Bitcoin may also be liquidated. But I have a really hard time being negative, even though LuxAlgo is saying, resistance is being created. So the net of the net is you want to buy support. And if Zcash can't find support at 458, Zcash will probably find support at 400. I hate to think of what that means for Bitcoin, but I mean, that's what I think the program is there. And this thing about every day, there's an article about, I don't know, mass surveillance, and who knows, Europe may need it because after what's going on in Spain, do they need to, monitor their citizenship? They're going to tell you that. They're absolutely going to tell you that. And this kind of stuff makes me afraid for the midterm elections. In other words, hopefully the Clarity Act passes so we don't have to worry about some wild shift to the left or anti-crypto policies. I think with all the banks calling for it and Bessent leaning on people, because I think if we're going to wrap this up in a crypto kind of way, if Bessent is right and that editorial or that tweet that he wrote is right, he's telling Congress, you're not getting any sugar for whatever you want sugar from the Treasury. You're not going to get the sugar that you need if you don't do us a favor, don't do us a solid, and pass the darn Clarity Act. The fact that it came from the Treasury Secretary, to me, resonates on their ability to get it done. And even though it's not the trade today, somebody is going to ask, do we want to own Nasdaq? Sure, they've been ingrained to buy the dip, but is that the right trade? Is everybody going to go after this volatility? Oh, yeah, we'll lend money to these guys. We'll lend money to Uncle Sugar. Is it back to business? Do you just go back to business after kind of a move like this where you have liquidation and scars right before people are leaving? I don't know. I think if they had to save Nasdaq, because they did, they had to save Nasdaq, that liquidity eventually finds its way to crypto. Is it today? No. But, I mean, they can't let Nasdaq blow up. They can't let the bond market blow up. They could. And the thing that drives me nuts, is this person from the Fed. Ever seen her before? Ever heard about her? From the Fed in Cleveland. And, you know, you don't get to these positions. You don't get to be on the FOMC by being some nobody. But, you know, now all of a sudden she thinks the Fed should raise rates, and she's making more noise than Warsh is. You know, I get this feeling, and I think somebody said this, that Warsh may be the head of the Fed, but it feels like the powers that be that want to, like, you know, bury you so you have to continue to borrow money to buy food. They just want to plow you under. And when I see this, I'm like, you know, a lot of this hyperscaler stuff has got fake accounting. The Fed wants to bury you. There was a comment from the executive branch the other day that we can't be bothered with Medicare and Medicaid because we have wars to prosecute. Now, look, again, sometimes I get accused of being favoring one side over the other, or saying I like this guy or don't like this guy. Is that the system you want to be in? Because this phony baloney in KOSPI, this like wild gambling, it has a bottom line in that people are not making it. And of course, they all did the wrong trade. Like the decentralized world, the rails, as Raoul Paul and Toby would say, they're coming. This AI trade being all about hardware and bad loans around hardware, yeah, that's a story. But the real story is what happens when these systems get loose. Like I saw a story this morning from the Eagle King where Anthropic's models got loose. I mean, I think every day, here it is. Like every day, either OpenAI has to, or Anthropic has to have disaster corn on the cob, right? By telling everybody, oh, my model got loose today. Anthropic says Claude gained unauthorized access to other organizations' systems. We reviewed our systems after what happened to OpenAI last week. It's funny how they all have the same problem at the same time, and they all release their models all at the same time. It's just funny how that works. These guys have the software to create agents that transact on the blockchain, among other things. The software is there. When the hardware is there, which is going to be very soon, these agents are going to get loose, and the idea of a layer one brings crypto out beyond Bitcoin. So the negative headlines from the from these AI companies saying our software got loose. Yeah, bro, your software is going to get loose. And when it does something positive, it's going to do it in crypto. And frankly, on a closing note, there's all this volatility in AI, in equities, because it's either an old trade or the wrong trade. Yes, people will buy the dip. Yes, it's a great trading market, whatever. But it's still the wrong trade long term. And it's exasperating to see everybody rushing to buy the dip in the hyper-levered casino when the stuff that's really going to move long term is left by the side of the road. And that in crypto is our test. Can we sit with the Bollinger Band in the perma boredom zone, In other words, can we live with two things? One, perma boredom, and one, fear that perma boredom can sometimes end to or can resolve in waterfall. These are the risks that we have to live with. Again, I think the only way Bitcoin really goes down that much is if interest rates get out of control via the long bond, right? That's why the thumbnail is like 5.2% with Bitcoin going up. Either that yield starts falling or bonds at least stabilize and rally. That allows for a major Bitcoin takeoff. But with these Fed governors on the tape and everybody going, we're not lending you any more money, the only way anybody's going to get the money they need, especially Uncle Sugar, is if the Fed prints it. And it's amazing how they're on the tape not understanding that, because back to Bessent for the final word, Bessent wants the Clarity Act so the stablecoin thing can kick into high gear, because Bessent knows they got to borrow $2 trillion a year. He is the Secretary of the Treasury and a former hedge fund guy. So we're going to get the Clarity Act, and Congress is going to get a phone call saying, if you want your sugar for next year, we need to get stable coins moving in a much larger fashion. We need to scale that up now. So vote yes and enjoy your vacation at the beach. That is the message I have for you. You know, don't chase hyperscalers on the upside after a 30% rally. Hopefully the rally doesn't fail. Hopefully it doesn't. But don't feed the bear. Beware of the failed rally. If you don't get one, wonderful. And let's pray Bitcoin can get some relief and get some liquidity flowing into the system, because that's going to be the key to a major turnaround, whether that's now or whether something has to break in the fall that eventually brings in liquidity. Okay, that is the market update for today. I think the Eagle King is here. Definitely appreciating Zepetis, Spartans forever. Thanking everybody in Patreon. You know, that TA report that we put in there was very accurate, right? And we're also, you know, doing some positive Michael Saylor positive Michael Saylor stuff that, you know, Saylor and the hyperscalers, not that different. Don't know why everybody's picking on Saylor. Wing Raven wants to buy gold. A lot of people do, right? Right. And, you know, like Wing Raven is also like, F these lizards. F these lizards. And I agree. The future is the decentralized world, whether it's down today or not. We will see you tomorrow.